I'm really excited to be here with you, to be in conversation with you today, and to have the opportunity to sort of share a little bit of what we're thinking about and what we're exploring at Invest in Open Infrastructure. So as Claudia was saying, my name is Emmy Tsang. I am the engagement lead at Invest in Open Infrastructure. And in the next 30-ish minutes, I hope to be more on the shorter side than the long, so we have more time for discussions. But I'm gonna first talk a little bit about what Invest in Open Infrastructure, or IOI, is, and then going into sort of why we think it's important to change the ways that we invest currently in research infrastructure. And then lastly, sort of give you a very quick summary examples of ways that we are approaching how to invest in open infrastructure. So brief words on IOI and what we are. So we're committed to increasing investment in and the adoption of open infrastructure to further equitable access and participation to research. IOI really began as a coalition of individuals, organizations, and institutions who have been the champions in not only open infrastructure, but also in advocating for libraries to fund and help support open infrastructure, and also working on the funder side to come together and look at what we can do to not only increase adoption of open infrastructure and the viability of open infrastructure and open source solutions, but also thinking about the sustainability of the funding and resourcing that goes into that. So lots of words there, and I think actually might make more sense. It's a little bit more important to kind of take a step back and think about and explore why we care about this work, why we're doing this work that we're doing. So why do we think it's important to change the ways that we invest in research infrastructure? And I'll note that I'm deliberately taking open out of this part of the presentation for a moment, because I want us to first focus on our relationship with research and scholarly infrastructure. So in that context, I think probably it's helpful to define kind of what we mean by infrastructure. And here, I would first say that we've actually done some research into what research infrastructure and infrastructure means. And if you're curious about that work, there's a link which I'm sure the organizers can share the slide deck later. There's a piece that we've recently put out, I think in April, on this specific topic if you want to find out more. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to define infrastructure as the systems, protocols, and software that research and scholarship rely on. And the rely on is kind of bolded out and italicized here because we are in thinking about, an analogy, right? Like the roads and bridges that we use and we have in cities and countries these days, thinking about kind of the impact and consequences when they're not operating or are removed, thinking about dependency and reliance. And this frame helps us to differentiate infrastructure from perhaps tools and software by considering what would happen when the infrastructure is not there or disrupted. Sorry. So going back to thinking about our current investments into and relationships with research infrastructure. At IOI, we reflect on constantly and examine the sort of broader ecosystem that we exist in. Our framing is that the ecosystem is sick. We think it's really important to recognize the broader issues that are plaguing our ecosystem. The current system for scholarly research and knowledge production that is geared towards commoditization is expensive for people to participate in, tends to capitalize on movements like open access and open data, and caters more to seeing higher education as a business rather than a place for idea generation, knowledge production, and learning. And this is, for us, really devaluing and underserving the global scholarly research community and perpetuating a system that rewards prestige, exclusion, and walled gardens. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples that we've been thinking about using to sort of re-examine and reflect on our work. One of them is sort of broader mergers and acquisitions in this space. And I'm quite sure that some of you would know about this particular example that is not that new anymore. So in terms of looking at mergers, right? On one case, you can argue that this is an increase in efficiency and think about it as a consolidation of certain entities. But where we think it starts to be concerning is, this is leading to a restriction in the number of choices that we have, locking us into certain pricing as consumers, and taking away opportunities for other competition, creating end-to-end platforms for data from kindergarten all the way to higher education to postgraduate. We are also aware of and are well versed in other pieces of ownership in this space when we look at groups, not only just Clarivate in that example, but also Elsevier. I'm sure also some of you have seen this diagram before, but here we're looking at this broad portfolio of RELX, which is the parent company of Elsevier, and where this starts to veer into areas where data has been potentially shared across many of those different other platforms, where there may be crowding out of other players and transparency concerns. And this, includes potentially usage data going from research tools that feeds into papers and publications, and then how that eventually feeds into metrics that affect tenure and promotion, the livelihood of people and career progression. And this is where it becomes problematic, in our opinion. There's really a need to start acknowledging this and to differentiate these different types of solutions, and also to make sure that we have choices in the market. In the past 3 years, in the current pandemic, we see the shift to to kind of a virtual setting in higher education and research. All of you in this call, including myself, would have had firsthand experience of that in teaching and in research, right? And this has really changed our relationship with technology. Bill Fitzgerald at the Consumer Reports, he said this quote that we have on top of the screen here: privacy has been getting shorthand in the education space for years before COVID-19. What's happening now with everyone having firsthand experience with software at a level that they never have in that areas is that the areas that have been ignored are getting attention really quickly. One example of that is highlighted in the work of Shay Swager, who's a senior researcher at the Future of Privacy Forum. Shay's been talking about and raising awareness on this issue of proctoring software violating student privacy. And this really is highlighting the role of institutions and libraries in stewarding the relationship between researchers and students, and how technology can affect that relationship by bringing some of these issues to the fore. Taking that one step further into examining our relationship with tools and services, and thinking about our reason for advocating for an examination and a change in what we invest in. Looking at, for example, services that we are relying on and purchasing, and also who they are doing business with. So Sarah Lamden, who is a professor of law at CUNY Law School, she's done extensive work looking at RELX and its relationship with some other groups, recognizing and highlighting that companies like RELX are not the publishers or the corporations that librarians are used to dealing with. Instead, these are groups that are, she called data barons or data cartels. And they have relationship with groups that have histories in jeopardizing student safety, in getting into long-standing contracts with Border Patrol, with policing, and with surveillance. And she actually recently gave what was part of a community discussion that IOI hosted together with Mackenzie Funk, who is a journalist who has done extensive work looking into and investigating this area as well. So there's a link at the sort of bottom left corner there that I encourage you to look at that recording of that conversation and understand, really highlights sort of the impact that we may not have considered before in terms of, the technology choices that we're making every single day. And this really prompts, the need for further examination into where we need to draw the line and stop exacerbating the profit margins of some of these corporations. So the examples that I just gave, I hope, have shown you that infrastructure is not neutral. our technical choices are not neutral. We need to re-examine our baseline assumption that all technology platforms are inherently good and designed to increase access, freedoms, and opportunities. And we share a collective responsibility to bring that critical eye into examining the consequences and impacts of our choice, not only on our own lives and those that we work with, but also for those who we intend to serve in our own communities. We need infrastructure as an enabler and an equalizer. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about open infrastructure. At IOI, we like to take an asset framing approach. We recognize that there are challenges and issues that exist in the ecosystem, but we also want to go beyond sort of building band-aid solutions. We think that it's important to think about what we are looking to enable in changing the ways that we invest, and in calling for an increase in investment and resourcing in research infrastructure. The 3 points that I've listed here are some of the connotations and attributes as we think about open infrastructure. And before I go into them, I kind of want to say, I think it's important to say that this is based on and built upon the work of many others in the field, like Spark, Core, and the principle of open science infrastructure, etc. So first, we think that it's important that infrastructure has openness ingrained at the operational and design level. Solutions should be open source. Content and data should be openly licensed. Pricing should be transparent. There should be clear governance processes and structures and guidance on how decisions are made. Secondly, infrastructure should be an enabler for communities to deliver collective benefits. This, for us, focuses on having the bidirectional relationships with the community and building maintaining the scaffolding that is needed for that bidirectional feedback and contribution process. And then last but not least, and a third important point is relatively specific to IOI's remit in looking at open infrastructure that's fueling research and scholarship, is that research infrastructure should be facilitating the creation and dissemination of open knowledge. So taking all of this into our minds, how do we move forward? And my approach here is to share some of our recent pieces of work at IOI. I'm going to give you brief outlines and some of the key questions that we're designing for and asking, and then a lot of links to, for you to explore in your own time, in the hope that, this will give you some initial seeds of ideas that we can explore together, either in, after I finish this presentation, but also for later within your own communities and organizations. So we know that it's not as simple as like building a change in the way that we invest in infrastructure is not as simple as calling off all of our subscriptions and transformative deals today. Deciding what to pay for, what to buy, how to invest, this is a complex process with many, many stakeholders. In 2020 and 2021, we commissioned a piece of research called The Future of Open Scholarship. We had 125 participants from over 18 countries participating, where they looked at where they viewed areas that are that they needed additional insight into, looking at collective and shared solutions that around shared infrastructure and the broader implications that they face in terms of the loss of funding, budgeting challenges, but also in terms of technological issues. So here are some of the key points of friction that was surfaced in that piece of research. First of all, is, I think everyone's familiar with this as well, time. Budget holders, decision makers sitting in research infrastructure management, libraries, ICT, what have you. We all need to meet the demands of administrators, but also users, and to keep up with an ever evolving and increasingly complex technological landscape, and to achieve all of this on a largely stagnant budget. So this has been one of the key points of friction that has really come to the fore in our investigation. The others being prioritization. So, when COVID first hit, there was a lot of sort of re-budgeting or focus on education and learning solution and proctoring solutions. how do you balance between those sort of near-term needs and gains versus the returns on longer-term investments? And in that process, whose values are getting applied? It's also local first development, the kind of tendency or need to prioritize institutional needs versus prioritizing for the network that you're looking at shared infrastructure across consortia or networks. Resourcing trade-offs and perceived resource scarcity. Looking at the two most common models nowadays of supporting for open infrastructure, the kind of membership on consortia support and the grant support, right? We learned about the constraint of these models in supporting adoption, development, and maintenance of open infrastructure. And this work really helped highlight the importance of to get out of these two models as a core means of supporting open infrastructure. So all in all, this work has been really helpful for us in helping us to orient and start thinking about the means that will help us scale or create different opportunities to interact with the technology and adopt it in a more reliable fashion. So faced with this relatively complex landscape and intricate networks of relationship, I've got 3 points here which kind of highlights our approach at IOI. So first, we do research. We believe that in order for investments into the space to be effective, impactful, and sustainable, we need those investment and funding decisions to be made based on evidence. For example, we're pulling together organizational and funding data in the sector to begin to look at what's funded and the gaps in that funding, and we conduct interviews and case studies and focus groups to understand sector needs, what's working well, where there are risks. Secondly, we are looking to provide recommendations and resources based on the evidence. We're working to make the research and findings that we're doing actionable for funders, budget holders, and other key stakeholders in the space, and we're doing this with them. And then last but not least, coordinating stakeholders. We know that doing the right thing takes more than knowing what to do. So we organize events and convenings to further a shared agenda for making open infrastructure the default in research. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about one of the kind of key pieces of resources that we've been working on since last autumn. The primary motivation for this work is really to address the information asymmetry that we're seeing in this space. We're trying to, through this work, figure out an approach to answer questions like, is one solution better for an institution versus another? Can we provide a set of baseline information so that we can start having a shared understanding on which we can have deeper dialogues and discussions? So the result of this thinking and exploration and work is what is now known as the Catalog of Open Infrastructure Services, or COIS. We launched an initial prototype in January this year. So this catalog started with sort of 10 projects. We did interviews with project leads and then also conducted public audits of information to obtain the information that is in this catalog. So the link is there on the screen, and I really encourage you to, when you have a little bit more time, to have a look at it. And I would say upfront that it's really, really important to us that we hear your feedback and opinions about this. So in terms of starting to build additional information of how some of these infrastructure services and groups align with some of the shared values and principles across the different library associations and institutions, we are, with this effort, also examining the other elements that may be helpful to provide that additional insight, for example, about the services finances, about their assets and liability. And you will find a lot of things in the catalog that you may find if you do take the time to do a deeper analysis. But then I think our focus here is really to prototype a way so that that information can be more easily accessible, that it is consumable, actionable, and understandable to, budget holders and decision makers. Just a little bit more on kind of how we went about creating the catalog. As I mentioned, we did data collection through interviews, but we also did an extensive audit of public information through, looking at websites, looking at annual reports, tax authorities' data, and as well as evidence from documented practices. And then on the right there, if you go to the catalog site, you'll also see kind of this table there. It's the evidence that we've used to illustrate each of the dimensions and indicators that you'll find within the catalog, as well as the sources of that evidence. So just to expand on this a little bit, the dimensions are kind of the characteristics that we think are important for open infrastructure. So reliable technologies, trustworthy organizations, and equitable and inclusive services. Now, the indicators are things that we're looking for at this initial phase of this project to look at what indicates those dimensions, right? So reliable technologies, for example, we're thinking about, do service providers have one or multiple open code repositories? Do they have an open data statement? Is there technical user documentation to allow people to contribute to the development of the service? For trustworthy organizations, we're looking for clear governance structure and processes, as well as documentation of their activities. And then equitable, inclusive service. Do they have a web accessibility statement? Is pricing transparent? Cost expectations? And is there a public commitment to equity and inclusion? Again, I want to reemphasize that this is the first iteration, and we're putting this forward as a prototype. So we're still in that process of looking at whether or not these are meaningful and useful for decision makers like yourselves. Some of the key questions that we've been asking throughout this process, and we're continue to learn from, and again, feedback from you would be really helpful here. What is the key information that decision makers are looking for in guiding their investment, and what's missing? What's surfaced in this work that may not be obvious to the broader community, but feels important to share? And then what trends and observations do we notice? Have these been reported before? Why or why not? So in the past 3 months, we've been working very closely with a group of funders and institutional budget holders to better understand the value proposition of this work, of this catalog for them, and how we can improve its design so that they can better act on the insights and information that we're providing. And in parallel, we ran an interest survey with the aim to identify more service providers, beyond the initial 10 to work with, to better understand how we can build the catalog as a sustainable, viable resource by understanding, what kind of data are we working with here? Will we be handling as we scale this effort up? How do we design technical and service infrastructure that's going to help us with the catalog's maintenance and growth? We're really excited to share more about this work in the next couple of months. So in our conversations with funders, budget holders, and other stakeholders in the community, lots of great questions came up. And for example, this is one example here. When we're thinking about trustworthy organizations that I talked briefly about before, and kind of what builds trust, we believe that having clear, effective, and meaningful governance is key to building trust from the community, as that clear governance ensure that community ownership and participation in the design, operation, and evolution of the infrastructure. But what does good community governance look like, right? Knowing that governance is something that evolves and is highly contextual, what is a minimal viable system for good community governance? We've recently published some research work carried out by our affiliates, Raven Klein and Sam Moore, on this, and we encourage you to look at that as well. And we are really excited to continue to build on top of this work. Other questions that came up in our conversations with budget holders and funders are things like, what are the gaps and concentrations in terms of the current support for open infrastructure, and how would that help inform our recommendations for funders and budget holders and their decisions? And to be able to answer this question, we need to be able to map and understand where the investment is currently flowing, who's contributing and paying into investing into this space, and where that money is going. What are the trends and observations that we notice? So this work is at a very initial phase. I can tell you that it's very challenging, much more than we've almost anticipated. But on the right, I'm showing sort of our aspiration and where we're hoping to move towards. This is an example from WHO. They have a global observatory on health research and development. And here you see a dashboard where they show kind of, the number of grants by funders, but also by grant types, by recipients, where they're from, what country they're based in, and then health categories. So for us, we're looking at this as an inspiration and a model where we can envision maybe building something towards the goals of making this information available, but also as a model for how that information can be portrayed, how that information can be communicated and consumed. I've also mentioned moving away from membership models and grant-based funding mechanisms. Again, this is very initial work, but we are definitely looking at sort of exploring different types of funding models. So the aims here for us is to think about, is it possible to set value-aligned conditions for ongoing investment, knowing that, we, again, in a lot of cases, can't call off existing investments and just replace them with new ones, right? But other things that we can do, for example, to code community ownership and nonprofit status, robust governance, open code bases, and other commitments to open outputs into those investments in the form of contracts, in the form of procurement processes, etc. We're also really interested in we are doing work in exploring kind of investment that would provide additional flexibility for projects. This actually is tied to one of our pieces of work that is going to come out in the next couple of weeks, looking at the financial health of the nonprofits in the research and scholarship sector as a whole. Right? So we actually have a researcher on the team who has a background in nonprofit management, who are trying to adapt some of the established methods there to look at what is the financial health of infrastructure and nonprofit organizations in this space. And actually, one of the things that have been surfaced is the need to move beyond kind of feature-based development and instead looking at providing operational support with ongoing investment in organizational advocacy and community engagement, as well as in product development and maintenance. We're in line with that. We're also looking at mechanisms that are defying traditional timelines for investment. Typically, grant funding is 3 to 5 years, as we know, and the expectation there is really to provide returns. And revenue can often be veered away from projects, away from serving the needs of the communities. This kind of model, we think, affects the ability for infrastructure to secure long-term viability and sustainability, and increases their risk of being acquired by commercial entities. So we're really interested in exploring mechanisms that sort of operate beyond this kind of timeline. Catalyzing and incentivizing collective investment from a variety of supporters. This is variety here for us. We've been looking at philanthropies, but also private trust, industry, institutions, governments. This also includes for us exploring things like reciprocity models, or means to incentivize contribution from a wide, range of stakeholders in the space, building the case for them to do so. Last but not least, very important to us is to look for ways to augment or build on and with others in the space, to ensure that we're actually, coordinating and learning from others with expertise, knowing that, this is not a problem that IOI can solve on its own. And we have a lot to learn from others who share our vision and aims. Just to put that into a timely context, let's say we're actually working on organizing a funders summit beginning of next month, I want to say in about 3 weeks' time. We're bringing together in this week a funders, budget holders, and other key stakeholders who have been involved in the financing and resourcing of open infrastructure to not only discuss some of the topics that I've talked about in the last 30 minutes, but also to really put those discussions into action and to test out, potential mechanism for collectively funding this ecosystem. So if you are involved in the financing and resourcing of open infrastructure and you're interested and available, send an email to contact@investinopen.org. And I'm happy to look at extending an invitation. And you can find more information about the program, which I know is really, really small here, but there is a bigger version on that website right there on the slide. I want to leave you with this question that we constantly go back to when we think about strategy and our work for it at IOI. If we're talking about the value of shared infrastructure and prioritizing equitable access and participation, then for whom becomes a really important question. Some of the conversations that we're having, including this one, including the ones that led to the founding of IOI, favors well-resourced Western institutions and scholars. We are operating in and with the inequities that exist in higher education, in open source, in financing and investing. What does that look like in terms of, countering our shared community values? What are the missing voices that we need to seek and involve when we talk about shared infrastructure? And I believe that this is a question, with no answer almost, but it's a frame and approach that we can all take, and a question that we should continue to ask ourselves, regardless of the organization or the context that we operate in. And a last take-home message, we believe that, open research and access to knowledge requires open infrastructure. The equitable and accessible participation in knowledge production and dissemination requires that our infrastructure is similarly designed and anchored in community values and governance. And that means shifting reliance from players misaligned with our core values of the community, transparency, and collective responsibility. Thank you very much for listening to that, and look forward to having a discussion.